The book of Hebrews comprises one of the most astute and comprehensive presentations of the Christian faith to be found anywhere in the New Testament, rivaled only by the epistle to the Romans. The book itself is somewhat mysterious. For one thing, it's an anonymous work. The author doesn't identify himself, and we have no idea who wrote it. We do know that the author was neither an apostle nor a person who had ever personally met or heard Jesus. He counted himself among those to whom the message of salvation was confirmed to us by those who heard. Chapter 2 and verse 3. We also know from chapter 13 and verse 24 that the author wrote from Italy, which may or may not imply that he lived in Rome at the time of the writing. Several possible authors have been suggested for this book, including Barnabas, Silas, Apollos, and even a prominent late first century Christian named Clement of Rome, who wrote one of the earliest non-canonical epistles in that body of early Christian writings called the Apostolic Fathers. But at the end of the day, we simply do not know the identity of the inspired author of the book of Hebrews. And in addition, it's difficult to classify the literary genre of this book. It's traditionally included among the group of New Testament books called the general epistles, that is, epistles written by somebody other than Paul. However, this book contains few of the usual characteristics of an ancient epistle. There is no epistolary introduction identifying the author and the recipients, and there is no customary blessing conferred by the writer upon his readers. There are no personal greetings exchanged at the end of the book, as we have come to expect from the epistles of Paul, as well as some of the letters of Peter and John. There's only a very general greeting without any mention of names. So as it stands, the book of Hebrews, while it may have indeed been an epistle, bears more of the qualities of the text of a sermon or some similar oral proclamation, in which case it would be unique among the New Testament writings. And furthermore, we don't know much about the people for whom the book was written. Its title and contents make it fairly certain that it was addressed to Jewish Christians, but whether these were Jewish believers still living in Jerusalem and the ancient Promised Land, or converts from the far-flung Jewish diaspora, is unknown. All we can say with any degree of confidence, based on the nature of the book's contents, is that the original recipients of this message were largely second-generation Jewish Christians whose painful experiences of rejection and persecution by the unbelieving Jewish community were tempting them to either compromise or completely fall away from their faith and return to the fold of Judaism. And the author's purpose is to urge his audience to remain steadfast in their Christian faith. And in making his plea, he offers a number of comparisons between the Old and New Covenants to demonstrate the superiority of the gospel of Christ to the law of Moses. Whereas the Old Covenant was established through the mediation of God's angels, the New Covenant was established through the mediation of God's Son, Jesus. Whereas the Old Covenant was sealed with the blood of animals, the New Covenant was sealed with no less than the blood of Jesus. And whereas the Old Covenant was administered by generation after generation of flawed, mortal high priests descended from Aaron, serving in a man-made representation of God's holy dwelling place, the New Covenant is administered by a single, sinless, eternal high priest, serving in the actual presence of God himself. And that high priest is Jesus. So it's all about Jesus from first to last. Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of God's eternal plan for saving man from the death penalty of sin. In this little study, we're going to take a deeper look into Jesus' role as the high priest of a new and better covenant. The Hebrews author boldly claims that Jesus' high priesthood was superior to that of Aaron and his descendants, a priesthood which had continued for nearly 1,500 years. So a fair question to the author at this point would be, on what basis do you claim that Jesus is a superior high priest to Aaron? In establishing the superiority of Jesus' high priesthood, the author turns to the Old Testament itself, as we read in Hebrews chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." Just as he says also in another passage, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." In these verses, the writer cites two passages out of the Psalms. Verse 5 quotes Psalm 27, the context of which is the declaration of the unrivaled universal authority of the Messianic King. Verse 6 quotes Psalm 110 and verse 4, in which the Lord confers an eternal high priesthood upon the same Messianic King. The Hebrews author puts these two quotations together to make an important point. The same God who declared Jesus to be the ultimate king in Psalm 2 also declared him to be the ultimate high priest in Psalm 110. And here we are introduced to a mysterious character named Melchizedek. In verses 7 through 10, our author goes on to explain how, through his obedient suffering even to the point of death, Jesus became qualified to be the Savior and High Priest of all who obey him. And again, he alludes to the prophetic promise of Psalm 110 and verse 4. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. In the very next verse, the author admonished his readers, saying that they were going to have to listen closely in order to understand the significance of Melchizedek and his argument for the superior high priesthood of Jesus. Concerning him, we have much to say, and it is hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. The next mention of Melchizedek in Hebrews comes up in chapter 6, in the context of our hope of receiving the spiritual blessings promised to the spiritual descendants of Abraham. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. If we find that we have trouble grasping the significance of Melchizedek in the Hebrew author's argument, perhaps we can be justified if we attribute it to a lack of teaching rather than an unwillingness to hear. In his message, the author makes several rather startling claims about the nature of this Melchizedek person. It's one of those difficult texts that teachers are often tempted to gloss over or avoid altogether. But we're going to do our best to get inside the author's head and understand what he was trying to say. The big question in all of this is, who was this Melchizedek? Why does the Hebrews author associate Jesus so closely with him? When and where did he serve as a priest? And what was it about that priesthood that both the psalmist David and the author of Hebrews found so impressive? Our search for the answers to these questions will take us back about 4,000 years. The only historical reference that we have to Melchizedek appears in Genesis 14, in connection with Abraham's rescue of his nephew Lot from foreign invaders. After separating his estate from that of his uncle, Lot had settled in the notoriously wicked city of Sodom, located on the plain east of the Dead Sea. And later, when Sodom and the other cities of the plain were conquered by a confederation of Mesopotamian cities, Lot and his family were carried off among the captives. When the news reached Abraham, who was still known as Abram at the time, he quickly mobilized the 318 men in his household and pursued and defeated the Mesopotamian Confederation and rescued Lot along with all the other captives from the cities of the plain. That in itself was a miracle. It was on returning from this battle that Abram met Melchizedek for the first and apparently the only time in his life. The encounter is recorded most succinctly in Genesis 14, verses 18 to 20. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram, of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he, that is Abram, gave him a tenth of all. The first thing we're told about Melchizedek is that he was a king. More specifically, king of Salem. Now, Salem is almost certainly to be identified with Jerusalem. The inhabitants of Jerusalem prior to the conquest of the city by David were Jebusites. Whether or not Melchizedek was a Jebusite or perhaps a member of another ethnic group that occupied that ancient city prior to the Jebusites is unclear. If he were a pre-Jebusite, it would mean that the Jebusite conquest of the city took place sometime during the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt, because the occupants of Jerusalem during the Israelite conquest of Canaan were definitely Jebusites. If the city changed hands between the times of Abraham and the Israelite conquest, it might explain why the Salem of Abraham's time had come to be called Jerusalem by the time of the conquest. Jerusalem might be a euphonic, that is a better sounding rendering of something like Jebus Salem, that is Jebusite Salem. The next thing we learn about Melchizedek is that he was a priest of El Elyon, which is translated God Most High. The nature of the El Elyon worshipped and served by Melchizedek has long been the source of academic debate. The preponderance of modern scholarship holds that Melchizedek was a priest of a pagan deity and that he found some kind of affinity with Abraham and the God he worshipped. However, it's not beyond credibility to regard Melchizedek as a fellow believer with Abraham in the true God. Now, that's not to say that God had revealed himself to Melchizedek as completely as he had to Abraham, but Melchizedek could have come up to faith in God in another way. Consider Paul's words to the Romans concerning the rejection of the knowledge of the true God among the people of the very ancient world. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Melchizedek may well have been an exception to the rule. A believer in the true God, whose faith was the result of an honest quest for truth, based on the evidence available to him. And refer again to Hebrews 11 and verse 6, where our writer says that God rewards those who diligently seek him. Melchizedek may be one example of such a person. It is worth noting at this point that Melchizedek's and Abraham's own words seem to confirm that they both worshiped the same God. Melchizedek, upon meeting Abraham after the battle, said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. The El Elyon worshipped by Melchizedek appears to be much more than a mere localized nature deity like those worshipped by the Canaanites. Melchizedek seems to have worshipped the God of all creation. And Abraham, when the king of Sodom offered to divide the spoils of the battle with him, said, I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, for fear you would say, I have made Abram rich. Abraham would never have accepted a blessing or taken an oath in the name of any other God than the one who had promised to make him the father of many nations. And then, in Psalm 78, verse 35, we find the name El Elyon unmistakably used to refer to the God of Israel. And they remembered that God was their rock, and the Most High their Redeemer. The translators changed the English word order, but the Hebrew for Most High God is exactly the same. El Elyon. Finally, we read that Abraham gave 1/10 of all the spoils of the battle to Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek and his people had had no part in the battle and had no legal claim to any of the spoils. Clearly, Abraham was showing deference to Melchizedek not in his role as king of Salem, but in his role as priest of God Most High. In giving a tithe of the spoils to Melchizedek, Abraham fully believed that he was giving it to God. And for these reasons, I believe we are on safe ground to believe that Melchizedek was indeed a worshiper, and at least for Abraham, a priest of the true God of heaven. And that is absolutely all we know about Mr. Melchizedek as far as the historical record of Genesis is concerned. When we turn to the book of Hebrews, however, we are given a portrait of Melchizedek which, at first blush, is simply astonishing. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of Man, he remains a priest perpetually. On the surface, it would seem that this text is attributing divine qualities to Melchizedek. And some interpreters have gone so far as to say that the Melchizedek who met Abraham after the battle was really a pre-incarnate manifestation of Christ himself. To a Jewish audience, however, familiar with both the Genesis narrative and the teaching methods of the rabbis, this picture of Melchizedek would have been recognized as a teaching method called midrash. Midrash is a method of interpreting biblical stories that goes beyond the simple analysis of the text as written. Hebrew scholar Wilda C. Gaffney writes that midrashim, that's the plural form of the word, midrashim discern value in texts, words, and letters as potential revelatory spaces. They reimagine dominant readings while crafting new ones to stand alongside, not replace, former readings. In less ivory-towered language, we might just say that a midrash captures and expands upon certain elements of a familiar story, using them as springboards into a discussion of a less familiar and usually more profound topic or concept. Now, if you're totally lost at this point, stay with me. I think you'll be able to understand what we're talking about in a minute. Midrash, when used skillfully and responsibly, was actually a brilliant way to teach such deep, profound truths. Proper interpretation and understanding of midrashic teaching usually requires familiarity with the culture and worldview of the original audience to which it was written. In our present case, the Greek words a pator, without father, and a mator, without mother, were variously used in Hellenistic literature to refer to homeless children of unknown parentage, or illegitimate children, or people who came from unimportant families. The first usage, children of unknown parentage, is probably the key to unlocking the portrait of Melchizedek in Hebrews 7. Certain details relating to his identity that are not given in the Genesis text are inserted midrashically into the story to emphasize certain points about the identity and nature of Jesus. Melchizedek appears quite suddenly in the Genesis narrative and exits just as suddenly. We're not told who his parents were, when he was born, how old he was when Abraham met him, when he died, nothing. It's a simple matter of now you see him, now you don't. When the Hebrews author says that Melchizedek had neither beginning of days nor end of life, he doesn't mean that Melchizedek was of eternal existence, but simply that those dates are unknown to us. That is a midrash. When he says that Melchizedek is without father or mother or genealogy, he doesn't mean that he had no parents or family tree. He means that the absence of his genealogical record is significant in and of itself. The critical point of this midrash is that what was true of Melchizedek only with regard to the historical record of his life is literally true of Jesus. Jesus, as the second person of the Godhead, is literally without beginning or end. He exists eternally. Now, with regard to his human ancestry, it might seem at first that the midrash breaks down a little. Because although the man Jesus had no human father, he did have a human mother, the Virgin Mary. And he had a human genealogy, as attested by the genealogy lists of Matthew 1 and Luke 3. However, Jesus had no father or mother or human genealogy that would qualify him to be a Levitical priest, being as he was a descendant of the tribe of Judah rather than the tribe of Levi. And that's the main point of the midrash of Melchizedek in the book of Hebrews. It is of utmost importance to the Hebrews writer's argument that neither Melchizedek nor Jesus could have served as a priest under the law of Moses. To serve as an Old Testament priest, a man must have had an impeccable genealogy documenting his descent from the tribe of Levi, and more specifically from the family of Aaron. We read in Nehemiah 7 and 64 that after the return from the Babylonian exile, certain priests whose genealogy could not be firmly established were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. Jesus' genealogy, as we have already noted, is traced not from the tribe of Levi, but the tribe of Judah, a point our writer emphasizes in Hebrews 7 and 14. Melchizedek's genealogy is totally unknown, almost as though he had no father or mother or ancestors. But what we do know is that since he was not even an Israelite, much less a Levite, he certainly could never have served as a priest under the Old Covenant. Yet Melchizedek is clearly presented in Genesis 14 and Psalm 110 as a legitimate priest. And Jesus is declared 5 times in the book of Hebrews to be a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. The Greek word translated order is taxis. It's the source of the English word taxonomy, the science of classifying and ordering organisms. In this context, however, it has the meaning of a post or rank or position that someone holds in a civic, military, or religious chain of command. To say that Jesus serves as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek is to say that he holds whatever degree of rank, prestige, or authority that Melchizedek held. As the Hebrews author continues his argument, he makes it clear that the order of Melchizedek is decidedly superior to the order of Aaron. Melchizedek was a priest extraordinaire. Now observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the choicest spoils. And those indeed of the sons of Levi who receive the priest's office have commandment in the law to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their brethren, although they are descended from Abraham. But the one whose genealogy is not traced from them collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed the one who had the promises. But without any dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater. In this case, mortal men receive tithes. But in that case, one receives them of whom it is witnessed that he lives on. And, so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Thus, the Midrash continues. When Abraham returned from the victory over the Mesopotamian Confederation, he paid a tithe of the spoils to Melchizedek and received a blessing from him. In this interaction, Melchizedek held the superior role of the benefactor, while Abraham held the inferior role of the beneficiary. And by logical extension, since their father Levi was still in the loins of Abraham at the time, the Aaronic priests also paid tithes to Melchizedek. The theological conclusion, then, is that the priesthood of Melchizedek was superior to the priesthood of Aaron. And therefore, since Jesus is a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, Jesus' high priesthood is also superior to that of Aaron. In Hebrews 7 and verse 3, the writer makes a most important point. He says that Melchizedek is made like the Son of God. Notice that he does not say that the Son of God is made like Melchizedek. Melchizedek was just as human as you or me. He had a father and a mother. We just don't know their names. He was born, he lived, and he died. We just don't know when. All we know of Melchizedek is that he was, if only for a brief moment in time, Abraham's priest, and it is as such that he is frozen in time and memory. For that reason, he remains forever in our minds as the priest who is greater even than Aaron and his descendants. But it is not Melchizedek who sets the standard and Jesus who conforms to it. Rather, the Hebrews author midrashically re-images the scant historical record of Melchizedek to illuminate magnificent truths that apply far more fully to Jesus than they ever did to Melchizedek. As the law of Moses was only a shadow of the gospel of Christ, as we read in Hebrews 10:1, just so we can say that Melchizedek was only a shadow of Christ. And so, through this complex imagery drawn from the life of Melchizedek, the Hebrews author masterfully presents to us the new, superior, perfect high priest, Jesus. In the middle chapters of the book, the Hebrews author repeatedly emphasizes that Jesus is an infinitely superior high priest to the sons of Aaron. Unlike the Aaronic priests, whose terms of service were limited by death, Jesus overcame death and lives forever. And this is clearer still if another priest arises according to the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become such not on the basis of a law of physical requirement, but according to the power of an indestructible life. Unlike the Aaronic priests, who had to offer imperfect sacrifices every day, first for their own sins and then for the sins of the people, Jesus, being without sin, had no need to offer a sacrifice for himself, but rather offered himself once for all time as the perfect sacrifice for all the sins of all people. For it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son made perfect forever. So again, it's all about Jesus from first to last. Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of God's eternal plan for saving man from the death penalty of sin. And when the Hebrews author introduces us to this remarkable and mysterious man named Melchizedek, he does not mean for us to look at him with wonder and awe. He means for us to look at Jesus with wonder and awe.